Criminal gangs will find ever cheaper ways to ply their evil trade. They will exploit our humanity, and our enemies will also see that we are unable to deal with this, and then they will so increasingly use migration as a weapon, deliberately driving people to our shores to try to destabilise our societies. Our citizens, who won't understand why their money should have to be spent on dealing with the consequences of this evil trade, it will destroy the public's faith, not just in us as politicians, but in our very systems of government. Making that deterrent credible will mean doing things differently, breaking from consensus. And both Georgia and I are prepared to do that. Georgia is planning to send asylum seekers to Albania to be processed, and I am passing legislation so that we can send illegal migrants to Rwanda. If people know that they won't get to stay, then they won't come. And that must be our aim, that everyone knows that if they come to Italy or to Britain illegally, then they simply won't get to stay.
The United Kingdom has been grappling with a significant rise in anti-Semitism and the presence of controversial preachers, prompting the Prime Minister to take decisive action against those misusing free speech to propagate hate and violence under the guise of peaceful protests. This issue has become increasingly contentious, with various groups and communities expressing divergent opinions and concerns.
The reason that they are boycotting Barclays, and this is all coming from the Palestinian Solidarity campaign. Today is one of their national days of action, where they're calling on people at branches across the country to boycott Barclays. They say it's because the bank, from their own research, has £1 billion, they say, in shares, and provides £3 billion in loans and underwriting to 9 companies, they say, whose weapons components and military technology, they say, are being used by Israel on their attacks in Gaza. So that's why they want people to boycott Barclays, with the idea being that, therefore, if people boycott Barclays and they take their business elsewhere, police these kind of protests when we see things which are alarming and intimidatory, rather than just maybe mind the protesters. Certainly there was some involvement from the West Midlands Police here in Wolverhampton today, when there was a passerby who was obviously growing in frustration at the repeated Palestinian protests in the likes of cities like this in Wolverhampton, where we are today. It wasn't so much greater size in numbers particularly. It was small numbers, so that's probably why the police were able to get involved more freely. When we have that first, again, since that point of Rishi Sunak's speeches on the steps of Downing Street on the 9th of March, that big, more national protest for Palestine, that's when we'll really see whether the words of the Prime Minister have been taken in by the likes of the Metropolitan Police down in London, and we'll see then how these protests are policed in the coming weeks.
Pro-Palestinian protests have specifically targeted Barclays, accusing the bank of indirectly supporting companies that sell weapons to Israeli forces operating in Gaza. Protesters advocating for Palestinian rights have initiated boycotts against Barclays, aiming to disrupt its financial operations and influence its stance on funding weapon manufacturers. However, these actions have not been universally supported, leading to a polarised debate within the public sphere. Law enforcement responses to these protests have varied, but there has been a notable shift towards more proactive policing under directives from figures like Sunak, who emphasised stringent measures to prevent violent escalations during demonstrations. This stance reflects a broader governmental effort to bolster police capabilities and ensure public safety amid heightened social tensions.
Did you sense, though, that the police appear to have more confidence in their behaviour? Because a lot of the time when I've watched the police, they've looked somewhat timid when it comes to sort of speaking and approaching protesters.
It's certainly, well, when they kind of got knack of this starting to, I wouldn't say kick off, because there was no kind of physical involvement between the two parties, but when the shouting got a little bit louder, the police were straight over just to kind of come and try and pull these two people apart and just try and move this member of the public that was obviously not happy with these protests today, move them on. Certainly the police presence has been greater here today than maybe it has been previously. And yes, certainly I'd say, Nana, that my observation is that they were certainly quicker to get involved involved and not just stand around maybe watching, as some criticism has been of them before.
Opposition to the pro-Palestinian movement and controversial speakers often comes from pro-Israeli groups and supporters who vehemently defend Israel's actions and criticise perceived biases in the media and public discourse. This opposition underscores deep-seated divisions within the UK regarding Middle Eastern geopolitics and domestic policies. Sunak's aggressive stance against hate speech during protests, particularly those involving anti-Semitic rhetoric, has sparked controversy and drawn criticism from political commentators across the ideological spectrum. Some view it as a necessary step to maintain social cohesion and protect vulnerable communities, while others argue it may alienate certain voter demographics, including Muslims who feel unfairly targeted or misrepresented.
Well, joining me now from Israel to discuss the conflict, there is Mustafa Uri Geller. I wanted to ask you straight away, were Rishi Sunak's words welcome words from where you are in Israel?
We usually talk about what's going on in Israel. But today, I want to ask, what's going on in Britain? What is happening to your country? So, last week, jihadists hijacked Big Ben. Then your MPs say they're getting death threats. And now, some Hamas fanboy called George Galloway has been elected. What is happening to British democracy? Hey, George, you refuse to meet Israelis. Remember, George, how you came running up to me? Yes, you came to me because I was famous.
Anyway, sorry, go on, Uri.
About Israel. Look, seriously, here in Israel, we got some terrible news last night. You know, as you know, Hamas has been holding dozens of Israeli hostages for 148 days. Well, now it says that 7 more have been killed. This is unbearable for Israel. Do not forget that Hamas has caused this war. Israel wants to end the war.
The broader debate over Islamism's place in UK society has intensified, exacerbated by global conflicts such as the Israel-Hamas conflict, which has further polarised opinions among the far right and far left. This complex issue raises fundamental questions about cultural integration, religious freedoms and national security, with ongoing debates on whether a middle ground can be found amidst competing interests and ideological stances.
On tonight's show, my Friday friends, star historian David Oldroyd-Bolt and fearless political commentator Emma Burnell. Emma, were you inspired by the words of the Prime Minister?
I agreed with pretty much everything he said. I also kind of felt a bit meh at the end of it. I didn't feel like there was something that came out of that speech that made me feel, I know why I tuned into my television in this unprecedented moment at 5:40 on a Friday night. I am a partisan lefty. And when I say lefty, I do not include George Galloway in that.
And you want a Labour government?
I want a Labour government, but I feel it's important in moments like this that when I believe the Prime Minister is right, I say so. As I said, I agreed with the sentiment of the speech wholeheartedly. I just didn't feel there was that much there.
Now, David Oldroyd-Bolt, I know you were not bowled over by the speech, but this is stronger and more powerful than anything we would get from Keir Starmer, who will likely be our next Prime Minister.
To say I was not bowled over is a massive understatement. It was rather like someone standing outside a burning house and saying we're aware of a problem with rising heat in the sitting room. This is the most pressing issue of public order and safety, and it has been for many, many years. I don't think there is any difference in Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in this, because they're both equally afraid of the reality.
And I totally agree. And, of course, it's a bit of a talking shop at the moment and we need action, don't we? But I can't imagine Keir Starmer making a speech like that because he was so afraid of offending British Muslims.
Well, quite. He knows his client vote and he's not going to piss them off, is he? That's
I think
Would you accept that? Would you accept
no,
that?
I think that's unfair. We saw the clip of him being incredibly and rightly rude about George Galloway and his division.
The ongoing ongoing tensions surrounding anti-Semitism protests and political polarisation in the UK highlight profound challenges in balancing freedom of expression with maintaining social harmony and security. As these issues persist, they continue to shape public perception and policy discourse, influencing government responses and societal attitudes. Sunak's firm stance on combating hate speech within protests reflects a broader governmental strategy to uphold the rule of law and protect vulnerable communities from discrimination and violence. However, critics argue that such measures could potentially infringe upon civil liberties and freedom of assembly, raising concerns about the scope and enforcement of anti-hate speech legislation in democratic societies. The pro-Palestinian protests, particularly targeting financial institutions like Barclays, underscore broader concerns over corporate accountability and ethical investments. Supporters of the boycott argue for economic pressure as a means to influence political change, while detractors question the effectiveness and unintended consequences of such tactics on global financial markets and diplomatic relations. In response to heightened tensions, law enforcement agencies have faced increased pressure to manage protests effectively and prevent outbreaks of violence. The role of policing in maintaining public order while respecting fundamental rights has been a subject of scrutiny and debate, with calls for greater transparency and accountability in police actions during civil unrest.
And I think, again, I come back to what I was just saying. If we, as people who believe in democracy, want to stop the extremists from either end taking over, we have to not make this false equivalence between where Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak may sit somewhere on their roughly agreeing tracks.
In the past 20 years, how many attacks on public people, figures...
Well, one, she was my friend.
Yes, and that was one. It was appalling and tragic. But how many have been from the Islamist thread? 7/7 bombings? The London Bridge attacks, the killing of David Amis. This is not an equivalent.
Well, OK, but go back further. You've got the Lord Admiral bombing. Yeah, that was a far-right bomber. The bombing, the nail bombs in Brick Lane. The point I'm trying to make is
MI5 aren't worried about the far right, even though it's a concern. They're worried about Islamism, aren't they?
And they are right to be worried about the extremists. But what I'm saying
because they're a moderate Islamist. Islamism is, by definition, an extremist, a violent and an unreasonable...
But again...
I have said now 3 times that Islamism is not equivalent to Islam.
But I'm not saying it is. I'm saying
so
that...
that's not... Again, it's a false equivalence.
It's not a false equivalence. Islamism is an extremism. Right-wing extremism is an extremism. We should deal with both of these things without saying that one side, Labour's more supportive of one, the Tories are more supportive of the other. That's not the kind of politics we should be having.
The opposition from pro-Israeli groups and supporters highlights deep-rooted divisions within British society regarding Middle Eastern politics and international conflicts. These divisions often manifest in heated debates within media, academic circles and public forums, reflecting diverse perspectives on issues of identity, justice and global solidarity. The controversy surrounding Sunak's policy directives has resonated across political spectrums, drawing reactions from advocacy groups, religious communities and international observers. The balance between protecting free speech and combating hate speech remains a delicate challenge for policymakers, requiring nuanced approaches to address complex societal issues without stifling democratic freedoms. The broader implications of these debates extend beyond national borders, influencing global perceptions of the UK's stance on human rights, multiculturalism and geopolitical conflicts. As such, the UK's response to internal challenges related to anti-Semitism and protests carries significant implications for its international standing and diplomatic relations with allies and partners worldwide. The debate over Islamism and its place in British society continues to evolve, shaped by ongoing cultural, political and security considerations. The integration of diverse religious and cultural identities within a pluralistic society remains a fundamental challenge, with ongoing efforts to promote social cohesion while safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. Nationalist sentiments and concerns over immigration policies intersect with debates on multiculturalism, reflecting broader anxieties about identity, sovereignty and community cohesion. These debates often highlight competing narratives and perceptions of belonging, with implications for social cohesion and political stability in an increasingly interconnected world. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Tell us in the comments below and subscribe for more.